The chainsaw kicked back harder than Daniel Cross expected, nearly taking his hand off before the safety brake caught. His 12-year-old daughter Maya was the one who screamed, her voice cutting through the screech of metal on frozen wood, bringing Daniel back to awareness that he'd been working too fast, too recklessly, driven by the kind of desperation that made men dangerous to themselves. He set down the saw with hands that were shaking from cold and adrenaline and something deeper, the bone-deep fear of a man who'd bet his last $430 on an abandoned sawmill and had exactly 9 days before the bank foreclosed on the trailer where he and Maya had been living since her mother died. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Maya approached carefully, her breath clouding in the January air, her too-thin coat doing almost nothing against the Oregon cold. "Dad, you okay?" "Yeah, sweetheart. Just got careless." Daniel flexed his fingers, checking for damage, finding only the ache of overworked muscles and the cut across his palm where the chain had grazed him before the brake engaged. Not deep enough for stitches, just another scar to add to the collection. "Why don't you go warm up in the truck? I'll finish this section. We could stop for today. Come back tomorrow." Daniel looked at the massive Douglas fir log he'd been sectioning, one of dozens scattered across the abandoned Cascade Lumber Company property like the bones of giants. The sawmill had been closed since 1987, left to rot when the timber industry collapsed and the Barrett family who'd owned it went bankrupt. The county had seized it for taxes 3 years ago, and nobody had wanted it since, too remote, too deteriorated, too expensive to demolish or restore. But the logs were still there. Old-growth timber that had been cut just before the mill closed, left to weather for 35 years but still solid, still valuable to furniture makers and craftspeople who paid premium prices for wood this size and age. Daniel had done the math carefully. If he could salvage and sell 20 logs, he'd clear maybe $15,000 after expenses. Enough to pay off the medical debt from Emma's final hospital stay, enough to keep the bank from taking the trailer, enough to buy time to find steady work instead of scrambling for day labor that paid cash and disappeared when weather turned bad. He'd bought the sawmill at a county liquidation auction, bidding against scrappers who wanted the metal and equipment. $430, nearly everything he had left after January rent, for 15 acres and buildings that were more liability than asset. The auctioneer had been clear, buyer responsible for environmental cleanup, property sold as is, no warranties or guarantees. Daniel had signed the paperwork with the sick certainty of a man gambling his family's survival on wood that might be too rotted to sell and buildings that might collapse on him while he worked. But he was out of options, out of time, out of the kind of luck that kept people afloat when circumstances turned against them. Maya stayed despite his suggestion, watching him work with the quiet assessment she developed since Emma died. She was too young to carry this kind of weight, but life didn't care about what children should or shouldn't have to understand. She knew they were broke, knew the trailer was days from foreclosure, knew her father was working himself sick trying to salvage something from circumstances that kept getting worse. They worked through the short winter day, Daniel cutting logs into transportable sections, Maya helping mark measurements and clear debris. The sawmill property was vast and overwhelming, its buildings slowly collapsing into the Oregon rainforest that was reclaiming cleared land. The main mill building was a cathedral to dead industry, massive saws still in place, conveyor systems rusted solid, the smell of old wood and decay in machinery that had stopped moving decades ago. Daniel had been avoiding the main building, focusing on the easily accessible logs in the yard. The mill itself was dangerous, floors rotted through in sections, the roof sagging under years of accumulated moss and rain damage. But as afternoon faded toward early winter evening, he found himself drawn toward it, curiosity overcoming caution. "Stay here," he told Maya. "This building isn't safe." "Then you shouldn't go in either." "I'll be careful. Just want to see if there's any equipment worth salvaging." The lie was thin. Daniel knew the equipment was worthless, too old and specialized to have resale value. But something about the building pulled at him, a sense that he needed to understand what he'd purchased, needed to see the full scope of what the Barretts had built and abandoned. The main entrance was chained, but a side door hung open where vandals or weather had forced entry. Daniel slipped inside, his flashlight beam cutting through darkness that felt heavy with years in silence. The mill floor was vast, easily 100 yards long, filled with equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum. Bandsaws big enough to section trees 4 feet in diameter, planers that could smooth boards 20 feet long, systems designed for processing timber on a scale that didn't exist anymore. He walked carefully, testing each step before committing his weight, aware that 35 years of neglect had made the floor treacherous. Preparation and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The office section was upstairs, accessed by a metal staircase that looked more solid than the wooden structures. Daniel climbed slowly, his flashlight revealing a level that had been administrative space, desks still in place, filing cabinets hanging open and empty, windows broken and letting in weather that had destroyed whatever papers hadn't been salvaged when the mill closed. One office was larger than the others, corner position with windows that would have overlooked the entire operation. A brass nameplate on the door read Harrison Barrett, President. Daniel pushed the door open, finding a space that was better preserved than the rest, its windows mostly intact, protecting contents from the worst weather damage. Harrison Barrett's desk remained, a massive oak piece that was probably worth money to the right buyer. Filing cabinets lined one wall, mostly empty but showing signs of hasty evacuation, drawers pulled out, papers scattered, the chaos of a business collapsing faster than orderly shutdown allowed. Daniel searched through the cabinets methodically, finding old invoices and employee records, tax documents from the 1980s, the paper trail of a company that had once employed 200 people and had processed millions of board feet of timber annually. Behind the filing cabinets, hidden where it would only be visible if you moved the furniture, Daniel found something that stopped his breath. A seam in the wall, barely perceptible, outlining what might be a door. He pulled the cabinets away carefully, revealing what was definitely a hidden entrance, a panel that blended seamlessly with the office's wood paneling, secured with a lock that looked far newer than anything else in the building. Daniel examined the lock, finding it was modern, installed recently enough that the metal showed no rust. Someone had been here, had secured this hidden door within the last few years. He thought about walking away, about respecting whatever privacy this represented, but curiosity and desperation made a powerful combination. He returned to his truck, got the pry bar he'd been using on the logs, and forced the lock with the efficiency of a man who'd done construction work and understood how things were built. The hidden door opened onto a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Daniel's flashlight revealed stone steps, carefully constructed, leading down into what must be the building's foundation. He descended carefully, the temperature dropping as he went deeper, the air becoming still and cool in a way that suggested this space was sealed from the outside. The stairs ended in a chamber approximately 20 feet square, the walls lined with concrete, the ceiling supported by steel beams that looked original to the building's construction. And in the center of the chamber, impossible to miss, stood a vault. Not a small safe, but a proper bank vault door, the kind designed to protect serious assets, gleaming dully in the flashlight beam like it had been maintained even as everything else decayed. Daniel approached slowly, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. The vault door had a combination lock and a keyhole, both showing signs of regular maintenance, oil on the mechanisms, no dust or corrosion. Someone had been accessing this vault, keeping it operational, within recent enough time that the maintenance was still visible. He tried the handle experimentally, expecting resistance, finding instead that the door swung open smoothly on well-oiled hinges. The vault wasn't locked. It had been left open, as if whoever maintained it had departed expecting to return but never had. Daniel shined his flashlight inside, his breath catching at what the beam revealed. The vault was filled with documents, carefully organized in file boxes, each labeled with dates ranging from the 1950s through 1987. But it wasn't the documents that made Daniel's hands start shaking. It was what sat on the shelves along the vault's walls, stack after stack of stock certificates, bearer bonds, investment documents, all organized with the same meticulous care as the files. He pulled out one certificate, his flashlight beam illuminating details that made his pulse quicken. Pacific Timber Holdings, 1,000 shares, issued to Harrison Barrett in 1978. He pulled another. Northwest Forest Products, 500 shares, 1982. The certificates filled multiple shelves, representing investments in companies Daniel vaguely recognized: timber operations, real estate developments, manufacturing concerns. In a leather portfolio on the bottom shelf, Daniel found what appeared to be a complete accounting of the vault's contents. The document was handwritten, dated December 1987, listing assets with valuations that made Daniel's vision swim. Stock holdings, $47 million. Bearer bonds, $31 million. Real estate deeds, $22 million. Investment trusts, $8 million. Total estimated value, $108 million. The final page of the portfolio contained a letter, written in the same careful handwriting as the asset inventory. To whoever finds this, if you're reading this, I'm either dead or circumstances have prevented me from returning to complete what I started. My name is Harrison Barrett, and everything in this vault represents the true assets of Cascade Lumber Company, assets I hid from creditors in bankruptcy courts, from the government and from my own family. The mill failed in 1987, destroyed by environmental regulations and changing markets and my own miscalculations about the timber industry's future. I declared bankruptcy, told my family we'd lost everything, let the county seize the property for taxes. But I'd been preparing for failure since the early 1980s, converting company assets into bearer instruments and investments that couldn't be traced to me personally. I planned to wait until attention died down, then return and reclaim what I'd hidden. Use it to start over somewhere else, rebuild what I'd lost. But I'm 78 years old and my health is failing, and I'm starting to understand I may not live long enough to execute that plan. The vault and its contents are yours by right of property ownership. Everything here is legally yours, bearer instruments transfer with possession, the stocks are in a corporate name that dissolved 35 years ago, the bonds are untraceable. I hid these assets from everyone, which means nobody can claim them except whoever owns the property where they're buried. Use them better than I did. I built Cascade Lumber through hard work and ambition, but I also built it through cutting corners and bending rules and prioritizing profit over everything else. The environmental damage we caused, the old-growth forests we clear-cut, the communities we abandoned when the timber ran out, those are debts I'll answer for in whatever comes after this life. You found a fortune I stole from creditors and family alike. I won't insult you by suggesting there's an honest way to have this much money. But maybe you can use it in ways I didn't, build something that matters instead of just accumulating wealth. Harrison Barrett, December 1987. Daniel read the letter 3 times, his mind struggling to process the implications. He'd bought an abandoned sawmill for $430, seeking logs worth maybe $15,000. He'd found instead a hidden vault containing assets worth over $100 million, left by a man who'd faked bankruptcy while hiding a fortune that legally transferred with the property he'd purchased. He stood in the underground chamber holding a letter from a dead man who'd trusted that whoever found this vault would be desperate enough to buy worthless property and thorough enough to discover what had been hidden. The math was incomprehensible. $430 transformed into $108 million through pure accident and desperation. Daniel's hands were shaking as he climbed back to the office level, as he emerged into the mill's vast main floor where Maya was waiting despite his instruction to stay outside, her face showing concern at how long he'd been gone. "Dad, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Daniel looked at his daughter, at the too-thin coat and the worry in her eyes and the weight she carried because her father couldn't provide the stability she deserved. He thought about the medical bills and the foreclosure notice and the desperation that had made $430 seem like a gamble worth taking. "I found something," he said, his voice not quite steady. "Something that changes everything." The next morning, Daniel called the only lawyer he could afford, Marcus Chen, who'd helped him with Emma's estate and who worked on sliding scales for clients who couldn't pay standard fees. They met at the sawmill, Marcus's expression shifting from skepticism to shock as Daniel showed him the vault and its contents. "This is real," Marcus said, examining the stock certificates and bearer bonds with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. "These are legitimate instruments, properly executed, legally transferable. And if Harrison Barrett's letter is accurate, if he really hid these from bankruptcy proceedings, then what? I just found $100 million? Legally, yes. Barrett owned the property, hid assets on that property, and those assets transfer with property ownership. You bought the sawmill, you own everything on it, including what was hidden in the vault. Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking through implications. But there's going to be complications. The Barrett family is still around, still influential in this county. When they find out Harrison hid this much money, do they have to find out? Marcus met Daniel's eyes. If you want to liquidate these assets, convert them to usable funds, you'll need to work with financial institutions. That creates records, triggers reporting requirements. The IRS will want documentation, will ask questions about how you came to possess instruments worth this much. You can probably establish legal ownership, but it won't be quiet. People will know. Daniel thought about this, about the difference between finding a fortune and being able to use it, about the complications that accompanied any windfall large enough to matter. What do I do? First, we secure everything. Document what's here, photograph every instrument, create a complete inventory. Then we bring in a financial advisor who specializes in estate assets and bearer instruments, someone who can help you liquidate these holdings legally while minimizing tax exposure. Marcus paused. Daniel, this is life-changing money. But it's also the kind of money that attracts attention, creates problems, makes people into targets. You need to be very careful about how you proceed. They spent 3 days inventorying the vault's contents, Marcus bringing in a financial specialist named Patricia Owens who'd worked with estate liquidations and unusual asset situations. Patricia's assessment confirmed what Harrison Barrett's letter had claimed: the holdings were worth approximately $110 million at current market values, possibly more depending on how certain real estate parcels had appreciated. This is extraordinary, Patricia said, examining the meticulously organized documents. Harrison Barrett essentially created a time capsule of 1980s investments, many of which have grown substantially in value. These timber company stocks, several of them were bought out by larger corporations. The shares are worth multiples of their original value. The real estate deeds include properties that have appreciated dramatically. And it's all legally mine? Daniel asked, still struggling to believe this was real. As far as I can determine, yes. Barrett owned the property, concealed assets on that property, and you purchased the property with all improvements and contents. Bearer instruments transfer with possession, whoever holds them owns them. The stocks are in a defunct corporate name that reverts to the property owner. This is unusual but not unprecedented. Patricia's expression grew more serious. But Daniel, the Barrett family is going to challenge this. They'll claim Harrison held these assets in trust for them, that he didn't have the right to hide them from bankruptcy proceedings, that you're essentially profiting from fraud. Am I? Profiting from fraud? Legally, you're profiting from property you purchased legitimately. What Harrison Barrett did was probably fraudulent, but he's dead. The assets exist, they're on property you own, and possession is 9/10 of the law when it comes to bearer instruments. Patricia paused. But expect a fight. Expect the Barretts to make this difficult. The fight came within a week of Daniel filing the paperwork to begin liquidating the holdings. Thomas Barrett, Harrison's grandson, appeared at the sawmill with a lawyer, his expression showing a man who'd just learned his grandfather had hidden a fortune while telling his family they were ruined. You can't possibly think you have the right to keep this, Thomas said, his voice tight with anger and something that might have been grief. My grandfather built Cascade Lumber, supported this community for decades, employed hundreds of people. That money belongs to his family, not some opportunist who bought the property for pennies. Daniel had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed responses with Marcus, but facing Thomas Barrett in person was different from theoretical confrontation. Your grandfather declared bankruptcy, claimed he'd lost everything, let creditors go unpaid while he had $100 million. That's fraud, and I'm not the one who committed it. Harrison was protecting family assets from an unjust bankruptcy proceeding. The environmental regulations that destroyed his business were government overreach, punishing him for operating the way the industry had operated for generations. He had every right to preserve what he'd built. He had debts to pay. Employees who lost their pensions when the mill closed, suppliers who never got paid, environmental cleanup that the county had to fund because he claimed bankruptcy. Your grandfather stole from everyone who had claims on Cascade Lumber's assets. Daniel heard his voice hardening. I bought this property legally. What I found is legally mine. If you want to argue otherwise, take it to court. Thomas's lawyer stepped forward, a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Cross, litigation would be expensive and prolonged for someone in your financial situation. My client is prepared to offer a settlement, $2 million for all rights to the vault's contents. You'd walk away with more money than you've earned in your lifetime, avoid years of legal battles, and allow the Barrett family to reclaim what rightfully belongs to them. Daniel thought about this, about $2 million versus $100 million, about the fact that a week ago $2 million would have seemed like impossible wealth. But he also thought about Harrison Barrett's letter, about environmental damage in abandoned communities, about employees who'd lost pensions while the owner hid assets in a secret vault. No, he said. The assets are mine. If you want to sue, sue. But I'm not giving them back to a family that benefited from fraud while everyone else paid the cost. The lawsuit came 3 days later, Thomas Barrett filing on behalf of his family to claim the vault's contents as wrongfully converted family assets. The local newspaper picked up the story, and within hours Daniel was dealing with reporters asking about the fortune he'd found and the bitter man who'd hidden it, and the family fighting to reclaim what they insisted was rightfully theirs. Maya read the newspaper coverage with quiet intensity, her 12-year-old mind processing information about wealth and legacy and the fact that her father had somehow stumbled into the kind of money that could change everything. Are we rich now? She asked, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned not to trust good news. Complicated, Daniel said. We own assets worth a lot of money, but converting them to usable funds takes time and costs money, and the Barretts are fighting us in court. So right now we're still broke, just broke people with a very expensive legal problem. But eventually? If we win? If we win, yeah. Eventually we'd be rich. More money than we'd know what to do with. Daniel paused, trying to explain something he was still working through himself. But money that comes from hiding assets and defrauding creditors, that's complicated too. Harrison Barrett did real harm, to real people, and we'd be benefiting from that harm. Maya thought about this with the seriousness she applied to difficult questions. But you didn't do the harm. You just bought property and found what was hidden. That's not the same as stealing. No, it's not the same. But it's not completely clean either. Daniel pulled his daughter into a side hug. We'll figure it out. Make sure we use this money, if it becomes ours to use, in ways that acknowledge the harm Harrison Barrett caused. Build something good from something that started bad. The litigation moved slowly through the court system, both sides filing motions and counter-motions, the legal bills mounting in ways that made Daniel grateful for Marcus Chen's willingness to work on contingency. The Barrett family had resources and expensive lawyers, but the law was surprisingly clear. Property transfers included all contents unless specifically excluded, and bearer instruments belonged to whoever possessed them. Discovery revealed information that complicated everyone's narratives. Harrison Barrett had indeed defrauded his creditors, hiding assets while claiming bankruptcy. But the investigation also showed that many of those assets had been obtained through questionable means: timber contracts won through bribery, environmental violations that saved money by destroying watersheds, worker safety violations that had resulted in injuries and deaths that were settled quietly. The pension fund that had been lost when Cascade Lumber closed? Harrison had drained it 3 years before bankruptcy, converting it to personal assets that were now in the vault. The environmental cleanup costs the county had absorbed? Harrison had known about the contamination, had chosen to declare bankruptcy rather than address it, leaving taxpayers to fund remediation. Patricia Owens brought this information to Daniel with an expression that showed someone grappling with moral complexity. Harrison Barrett was worse than we thought. The fortune in that vault was built through systematic fraud, environmental destruction, and theft from his own employees. Legally it's yours, but the source is deeply problematic. What do you recommend? Establish a foundation. Use the assets to address the harm Harrison caused, fund environmental restoration, compensate former employees whose pensions were stolen, support communities that were abandoned when the timber industry collapsed. Keep enough to secure your own family's future, but dedicate the rest to cleaning up the mess this money was built from. Patricia's expression softened. That's what I'd recommend morally. Legally, you can do whatever you want with it. Daniel thought about Emma, about how she'd always insisted they try to do right even when right was harder than expedient, about the values she'd wanted Maya to learn. Let's do it the right way. Set up a foundation, address the harm, use this money to build something that matters more than just personal wealth. The court ruling came 6 months after Daniel had filed to liquidate the vault's assets. The judge's decision was clear and surprisingly emphatic. The assets belonged to Daniel as the legal owner of the property where they'd been concealed. The Barrett family had no claim to instruments their grandfather had hidden from creditors in bankruptcy courts, and the fact that Harrison had obtained the assets through questionable means didn't change their legal status as property that transferred with the sawmill. Thomas Barrett's face at the ruling was a study in devastation, a man watching $100 million disappear into the hands of someone he considered an opportunistic interloper. But he also looked tired, as if 6 months of litigation had forced him to confront truths about his grandfather that he'd preferred not to know. After the hearing, Daniel approached Thomas in the courthouse hallway, Maya beside him, both of them uncomfortable but determined. I know this isn't what you wanted. But I want you to know what I'm planning to do with the money. Thomas's expression was guarded, hostile. I don't care what you do with it. Harrison's letter talked about debts he'd answer for, environmental damage, abandoned communities, the costs of building wealth without considering consequences. I'm creating a foundation to address those debts. Environmental restoration, pension fund compensation, community support for places the timber industry abandoned. Daniel paused. Your family's name will be on it. The Harrison Barrett Foundation for Environmental and Community Restoration. Not erasing what he did, but trying to balance accounts. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his face showing emotions Daniel couldn't fully read. Finally, he said, Why? You won. The money's yours. Why tie it to a man who stole it through fraud? Because pretending it came from honest sources would be a lie. And because maybe acknowledging where money came from is part of using it better. Daniel met Thomas's eyes. Your grandfather was complicated. He built something significant, employed hundreds, supported communities. He also caused real harm, stole from employees, destroyed ecosystems for profit. Both things are true. The foundation acknowledges both. Patricia Owens helped Daniel establish the foundation, structuring it to address the specific harms Harrison Barrett's business practices had caused. $50 million went to an environmental trust funding watershed restoration and old-growth forest preservation. $20 million went to compensating former Cascade Lumber employees whose pensions had been stolen. $10 million went to community development in towns that had been economically devastated when timber jobs disappeared. Daniel kept $20 million for himself and Maya, an amount that still felt incomprehensible but that would ensure they'd never worry about money again. The remaining $10 million funded the foundation's operations and created a research center studying sustainable forestry and community resilience. The work of distributing the money took years, each payment requiring research and verification, ensuring funds went to people who'd actually been harmed rather than opportunistic claimants. Former Cascade Lumber employees came forward with documentation of pension promises that had disappeared, of workplace injuries that had been minimized, of wages that had been suppressed while Harrison accumulated wealth he'd eventually hide. Environmental scientists worked with the foundation to identify watersheds that had been damaged by clear-cutting and chemical use, to design restoration projects that would take decades but that might eventually undo some of the harm. Community development specialists helped towns that had been left economically hollowed out by the timber industry's collapse, funding job training and business development and infrastructure that might create sustainable futures. Maya grew up surrounded by this work, spending her teenage years watching her father transform an accidental fortune into systematic attempts at addressing historical harm. She volunteered with the Foundation's environmental projects, learned about forest ecology and watershed science, developed an understanding that wealth carried responsibilities beyond personal consumption. "Do you ever wish we just kept all of it?" she asked one evening when she was 16, both of them reviewing grant proposals the Foundation was considering. "Used it for ourselves instead of giving it away?" Daniel thought about this honestly. "Sometimes, when I'm tired or worried or just want things to be simpler. But mostly no. Your mom believed that trying to do right mattered even when it was harder, and this feels like honoring that. The money came from harm Harrison Barrett caused. Using it to address that harm doesn't erase what he did, but it's better than just benefiting from his fraud." Thomas Barrett had become an unexpected ally, joining the Foundation's board after 2 years of watching how Daniel deployed the assets. Their relationship wasn't friendship, the wounds were too deep for that kind of ease, but it was mutual respect and shared commitment to addressing legacy both carried whether they'd chosen it or not. "My grandfather was a bastard," Thomas said during one board meeting, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd spent years confronting uncomfortable truths. "He built Cascade Lumber through hard work, yes, but also through environmental destruction and worker exploitation and systematic fraud. I grew up hearing stories about what a great man he was, what he built, how he supported this community. Learning the truth destroyed that mythology. But the Foundation lets you acknowledge both," Patricia Owens said gently. "Harrison built something significant and caused significant harm. Both things are true, and the work we're doing addresses both." 10 years after Daniel had bought the sawmill for $430, the Foundation had distributed nearly $80 million to environmental restoration, employee compensation, and community development. The remaining assets continued generating returns that funded ongoing operations, creating what Patricia described as generational impact, work that would continue long after everyone currently involved was gone. The sawmill property itself had been transformed into an educational center focused on sustainable forestry and industrial history. The main building was stabilized and converted to museum space, telling the complete story of Cascade Lumber, its rise and fall, Harrison Barrett's fraud, the workers who'd built it and been abandoned when it closed, the environmental damage and the restoration efforts funded by the fortune he'd hidden. The vault remained in place, preserved behind glass, Harrison Barrett's letter displayed alongside it. Visitors could read his confession, could see where he'd hidden assets worth over $100 million, could understand how one man's fraud had eventually funded attempts to address the harm he'd caused. Daniel walked through the center occasionally, usually alone, thinking about the chain of circumstances that had brought him here. The desperation that had made $430 seem like a gamble worth taking. The thorough exploration that had led him to a hidden door and a secret vault. The choice to use found wealth for restoration rather than just personal enrichment. Maya had graduated college studying environmental science and had returned to work for the Foundation full-time, her career built around addressing the kind of harm her father had stumbled into responsibility for. She'd developed expertise in watershed restoration, had published research on healing ecosystems damaged by industrial forestry, had become a voice for the principle that wealth carried obligations to address the harm it was built from. "Do you ever wonder what Harrison Barrett would think?" Maya asked one afternoon, both of them standing in the museum looking at displays about Cascade Lumber's history. "About what we did with the money he hid?" Daniel thought about this. "I think he'd be surprised." His letter suggested he expected whoever found the vault to just take the money and use it personally. But maybe he'd approve. He talked about debts he'd answer for, about understanding his business practices caused harm. Maybe he'd recognize that using his hidden fortune to address that harm is fitting. Thomas Barrett overheard this conversation, his presence in the museum a regular occurrence now. "My grandfather was practical above all else. He'd probably think you were fools for giving away $90 million. Thomas paused. "But I think secretly he'd be impressed. He spent his life accumulating wealth and hiding it, died alone with his secrets, never got to enjoy what he'd stolen. You found it and built something that will outlast all of us." That's a kind of immortality he never achieved. 15 years after buying the sawmill, Daniel stood in the Environmental Trust's newest restoration project, a watershed that Cascade Lumber had clear-cut in the 1970s, leaving erosion and contamination that had devastated salmon runs and drinking water for downstream communities. The restoration work had taken a decade, but native trees were growing, the stream was running clear, early reports suggested salmon were returning. Maya worked nearby, directing a crew planting cedar saplings, her expertise and passion evident in every interaction. She'd built a career around healing damage that Harrison Barrett had caused, had found purpose in work that connected directly to the fortune her father had discovered and chosen to deploy for restoration rather than personal gain. "We'll never undo all of it," Maya said that evening, both of them tired from the day's work. Harrison Barrett damaged too many places, affected too many lives. But we're making a difference. These watersheds will recover. The communities we've supported are rebuilding. Former employees got compensation they'd waited 30 years for. That matters. Daniel nodded, thinking about the trajectory that had brought them here. Your mom would be proud of what you're doing. What we're doing. Using this money to try to balance accounts, to address harm, to build something that matters beyond just personal wealth. 20 years after finding the vault, Daniel retired from active leadership of the foundation, turning operations over to Maya and a team of environmental scientists and community development specialists who dedicated their careers to the work. The foundation had become an established institution, respected for its systematic approach to addressing industrial harm, its willingness to acknowledge difficult truths about how wealth was accumulated. The lawsuits had finally ended, the last Barrett family challenge dismissed 3 years earlier. Thomas Barrett had become one of the foundation's strongest advocates, his transformation from hostile litigant to committed board member a journey that had required confronting truths about his family that had been easier to deny than acknowledge. "My grandfather stole $100 million and hid it in a vault," Thomas said during his final board meeting before his own retirement. "Daniel found it and could have just taken it, could have disappeared with more money than anyone needs. Instead, he built something that addresses the harm my grandfather caused, that honors the workers he exploited and the ecosystems he destroyed. That's character. That's legacy chosen rather than inherited." Daniel stood in the Sawmill Museum on a rain-soft Oregon morning 25 years after buying the property for $430. The building breathed differently now, no longer abandoned but alive with purpose, its spaces filled with visitors learning about timber industry history and environmental restoration and the complicated legacy of wealth built through exploitation. The vault behind glass told its story silently, Harrison Barrett's letter visible, the empty shelves showing where bearer bonds and stock certificates had been stored, interpretive displays explaining what had been hidden and how it had been deployed after discovery. Visitors read about the fortune and the fraud, about the man who'd found it and the choice he'd made to use it for restoration rather than personal enrichment. Maya led tours occasionally, telling the story with the authority of someone who'd lived it, whose life had been shaped by her father's desperate gamble on an abandoned sawmill and the fortune he'd found beneath its decaying floors. She explained the foundation's work, the watersheds being restored, the communities being supported, the systematic attempts to address harm that had festered for generations. Outside, the Oregon rain fell soft and steady, the kind of precipitation that had grown the forests Harrison Barrett had clear-cut, that was nurturing new growth in places the foundation was restoring. The land remembered everything, the old-growth trees that had stood for centuries before being cut, the damage that had followed industrial forestry, the slow work of healing that was happening through patient investment and ecological understanding. Daniel walked the sawmill property alone as evening settled, his steps carrying him past the main building to the log yard where he'd been cutting salvage timber when this journey started. The logs were gone now, sold or donated or left to decompose and return nutrients to soil. The land was slowly reverting to forest, second-growth Douglas fir and cedar establishing themselves in patterns that would take a century to mature but that would eventually create the kind of ecosystem that had existed before human intervention. He thought about that desperate January morning 25 years ago, about the chainsaw kickback that had nearly taken his hand, about Maya's scream cutting through the sound of frozen wood. He'd been working recklessly, driven by fear and desperation, betting everything on salvage timber that might not sell. He'd found instead a hidden vault and a fortune that had transformed not just his life but the lives of thousands of people affected by Harrison Barrett's systematic fraud and environmental destruction. The money had been spent wisely, Patricia Owens had assured him during her final audit before her own retirement. $90 million deployed to address specific harms, to restore damaged ecosystems, to compensate stolen pensions, to support abandoned communities. The remaining $20 million had been invested conservatively, funding the foundation's operations in perpetuity while ensuring Daniel and Maya never worried about material security. That security had allowed Maya to build a career around environmental restoration, had freed her from the desperate choices Daniel had faced when Emma died and medical debt had consumed everything they'd saved. She'd grown up understanding that wealth carried responsibilities, that finding a fortune meant accepting obligations to address the harm it was built from, that legacy was something you built through choices rather than something you inherited passively. Above, stars appeared in gaps between clouds, the same patterns that had looked down on old-growth forests before logging, that had witnessed industrial exploitation and environmental destruction, that were now watching slow restoration funded by a timber baron's hidden fortune. The land held its secrets and eventually yielded them, giving up buried things when circumstances brought the right person to the right place at the right moment. Daniel had been that person not through virtue but through desperation, had found the vault because he was thorough enough to explore the property he'd gambled his last dollars on, had deployed its contents ethically not because he was unusually moral but because Emma had taught him to try to do right even when right was harder. The choice to create a foundation rather than just take the money had felt obvious at the time, but 25 years of watching its impact had shown him how unusual that choice had been. The sawmill stood solid in the darkness, its purpose transformed from timber processing to education and remembrance, its spaces filled with stories about accumulation and fraud and eventual revelation. Harrison Barrett's vault had held a fortune built through environmental destruction and worker exploitation, had been designed to preserve wealth stolen from creditors and employees, had waited 35 years for someone desperate enough to buy worthless property and curious enough to find what was hidden. That someone had been Daniel, though he'd arrived broken and desperate, though he'd been seeking salvage timber worth thousands and had found instead bearer bonds worth millions. The difference between what he'd sought and what he'd found had created possibilities nobody could have anticipated, had funded restoration work that would continue for generations, had transformed one man's hidden fortune into systematic attempts at addressing historical harm. The foundation would outlive everyone currently involved, would continue its work long after Daniel and Maya and Thomas Barrett were gone, carrying forward the principle that wealth built through exploitation carried obligations to address the damage it caused. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you accumulated but what you built, not what served your interests but what served broader purposes even when narrower choices would have been easier. Daniel stood at the property's edge where the forest began, where restoration work was slowly healing damage that had seemed permanent, where cedar and fir saplings were establishing themselves in soil that would nurture them for centuries if the work continued. The land was patient, would outlast human concerns, would remember everything and give back what it had taken if people worked with understanding rather than against natural patterns. He thought about Emma, about how she'd insisted they try to do right even when they were broke and desperate, about the values she'd wanted Maya to learn. The foundation honored that insistence, had been built on the principle that finding wealth created obligations rather than just opportunities, that money built through harm should be deployed to address that harm even when keeping it all would have been legal and easier. 25 years had passed since he'd bought an abandoned sawmill for $430, seeking timber worth thousands and finding instead a fortune worth millions that had transformed into a foundation worth more than monetary value could measure. The journey had been complicated, had required choices that were difficult and litigation that was exhausting and work that would never be complete. But it had been right in ways that mattered more than comfort or ease, had honored Emma's memory and shaped Maya's character and addressed harm that would have otherwise festered unaddressed. The sawmill's lights glowed warm against the Oregon darkness, marking a place that had been industrial exploitation and was now education and restoration, that told complete truth about timber barons' fraud and environmental destruction and the fortune that had funded eventual attempts at healing. Harrison Barrett had hidden $100 million expecting it would fund his comfortable retirement. Instead, it had funded watershed restoration and pension compensation and community development, had become the opposite of what he'd intended but perhaps what he deserved. That transformation had happened because a desperate man had bought worthless property and had chosen revelation over concealment, restitution over personal enrichment, building something meaningful over just accumulating wealth. The choice had felt obvious at the time, but its impact had been profound. Thousands of lives touched, ecosystems healed, communities supported, a new understanding that wealth carried responsibilities that transcended legal ownership. Daniel walked back to his truck as full darkness settled, his steps steady on ground that had been logged and abandoned and was now slowly returning to forest. The work would continue without him now, Maya and her team carrying forward the Foundation's mission, future generations inheriting responsibility for healing damage their predecessors had caused. That continuity was what mattered, the understanding that some work was never finished but was always worth doing. The land stretched away in darkness, patient and remembering, holding stories of what had been and what might be, of forests that had stood for centuries and forests that would grow for centuries more if people chose stewardship over exploitation. Harrison Barrett's vault had held a fortune built through destroying that natural wealth. That fortune was now funding its restoration, creating a symmetry that felt like justice even if it came too late for the old-growth forests that had been cut and too late for the workers who'd been exploited. But justice that arrived late was still justice, restoration that happened slowly was still restoration, and legacy built through conscious choice was more meaningful than legacy inherited passively. The sawmill stood as proof that buried things eventually surfaced, that fortunes built through fraud could be deployed for healing, that desperate gambles sometimes led to places that mattered more than anyone could have predicted. Daniel drove away from the property as the first winter storm of the season moved in, rain beginning to fall in patterns that would nurture the seedlings Maya's team had planted, that would slowly wash contaminants from soil and heal watersheds damaged by industrial forestry. The land was recovering, the work was continuing, and the fortune that Harrison Barrett had hidden to preserve his comfortable retirement was instead creating restoration that would outlast everyone involved. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy written in restored ecosystems and compensated workers and supported communities, in the understanding that finding wealth created obligations to address the harm it was built from, in the choice to build something meaningful rather than just accumulate personal fortune. The vault had held $100 million, but its real value was what that money had become when deployed with intention and conscience and the understanding that some debts transcended legal obligations and required moral accounting. The foundation would stand long after Daniel was gone, would continue its work across generations, would carry forward the principle that wealth and harm were often connected and that addressing one required acknowledging the other. Harrison Barrett had hidden a fortune expecting it would fund his escape from consequences. Instead, it had funded systematic attempts to address those consequences, had become the opposite of what he'd intended but perhaps exactly what was needed. The land would remember all of it, the forests that had been cut and the forests that were growing, the fraud that had been committed and the restoration that had followed, the man who'd hidden wealth and the man who'd found it and chosen to deploy it for healing rather than hoarding. Those memories would outlast individuals, would persist in healed watersheds and restored ecosystems and communities that had found new resilience. Daniel had been the catalyst through desperation and thorough exploration, had made choices that felt obvious but had proven unusual, had built something that would outlive him because Maya and others would carry it forward. That continuity was what mattered, the understanding that legacy was built through choices compounded over time, that one man's desperate gamble could lead to places that transformed thousands of lives if the person who stumbled into fortune chose responsibility over personal enrichment. The storm intensified as Daniel drove home, rain falling hard enough to test the truck's wipers, the kind of weather that would fill the streams and nurture the land and create conditions for growth that might take decades to fully manifest. But the work was patient, would continue regardless of individual lifespans, would carry forward the principle that healing was possible even when damage seemed permanent and that wealth could be deployed to address harm rather than just accumulate more wealth. The storm intensified as Daniel drove home, rain falling hard enough to test the truck's wipers, the kind of weather that would fill the streams and nurture the land and create conditions for growth that might take decades to fully manifest. But the work was patient, would continue regardless of individual lifespans, would carry forward the principle that healing was possible even when damage seemed permanent and that wealth could be deployed to address harm rather than just accumulate more wealth. 30 years after finding the vault, Daniel returned to the Sawmill Museum for a ceremony he'd been both anticipating and dreading. Maya, now 42, stood beside him with her own daughter, Emma, named for the grandmother she'd never met, a 7-year-old girl whose eyes held the same curious intensity her mother had shown at that age. The ceremony was marking the completion of the Foundation's most ambitious project, the full restoration of the Cascade River watershed, a 20-year effort that had transformed a contaminated, degraded ecosystem into functioning habitat where salmon had returned in numbers not seen since before industrial logging. The scientists presenting the data spoke in careful technical language, but the meaning was clear: the river was alive again in ways that had seemed impossible when the restoration work began. Water quality had improved to the point where communities downstream no longer needed expensive filtration. Native plant communities had re-established themselves along the riverbanks. Salmon were spawning in tributaries that had been too degraded to support them for 50 years. "Your grandfather found the money that made this possible," one of the scientists said to Maya, her voice carrying respect and acknowledgement of complicated legacy. "Without the Harrison Barrett Foundation, this watershed would still be damaged, these salmon runs would still be extinct, these communities would still be dealing with contaminated water. That matters. That's generational impact built from one man's choice to use found wealth for restoration." Maya accepted the recognition with the grace she'd learned from watching her father navigate similar moments, understanding that the Foundation's work carried both Harrison Barrett's name and the acknowledgement of harm he'd caused. "My father taught me that finding wealth creates obligations, especially when that wealth was built through exploitation and environmental destruction. The work we've done here, that you've all done here, addresses debts Harrison Barrett never paid while alive. It doesn't erase what he did, but it creates something meaningful from something that started with fraud and harm." Young Emma tugged at her mother's hand, her voice carrying the kind of question children ask when they're processing something important. "Grandpa found treasure under an old building?" Daniel knelt to his granddaughter's level, the same way he'd knelt to Maya 30 years ago when explaining difficult truths. "I found money that a man had hidden because he'd stolen it. Money that came from cutting down forests that had stood for hundreds of years, from not paying workers what they'd earned, from damaging rivers and streams. That money could have just made me rich, but your mom and I decided it should be used to fix the damage it came from." "So the river got better because of the bad man's money?" "Yeah, sweetheart. Sometimes good things can come from bad sources if people choose to use them the right way." Emma thought about this with the seriousness of a child trying to understand moral complexity. Did the bad man know his money would help the river? No. He died before anyone found what he'd hidden. But maybe he'd be surprised that it happened. Maybe he'd understand that this was better than just keeping it hidden forever. The evening brought a smaller gathering, former Cascade Lumber employees who'd received pension compensation through the Foundation, community members from towns the Foundation had supported, environmental scientists who'd dedicated careers to restoration work. Thomas Barrett attended, now 78, his face showing the weight of years spent grappling with his grandfather's legacy and his own role in helping address it. "I spent 40 years not knowing my grandfather had hidden a fortune," Thomas said during the informal remarks that followed dinner. 40 years believing we'd lost everything when Cascade Lumber closed, that Harrison had died broken and defeated. Learning the truth, that he'd stolen millions and hidden them while his employees lost their pensions, that destroyed every story I'd told myself about who he was." He paused, looking at Daniel with an expression that had evolved over 3 decades from hostility to grudging respect to something approaching friendship. But watching what Daniel built with that money, watching Maya carry it forward, seeing watersheds restored and communities supported and workers compensated, that created something I could be part of. My grandfather's name is on this foundation, but it's attached to work that addresses the harm he caused. That's complicated legacy, but it's honest legacy. It tells the truth about what he did and what we chose to do with what he left behind. Daniel stood at the restored riverbank as twilight painted the water in shades of silver and gold, watching salmon move upstream in patterns that had been interrupted for generations but were now re-established. Maya and Emma joined him, 3 generations standing together where old-growth forest had once stood before Harrison Barrett's crews had cut it, where degradation had persisted for decades before restoration work began healing the damage. "Mom talks about you finding the vault like it's a legend," Emma said, her small hand in Daniel's. "Like a story about a hero finding treasure." "It wasn't heroic," Daniel said gently. "I was desperate, needed money to keep us from being homeless. I bought the sawmill hoping to sell salvage timber worth a few $1,000s. Finding the vault was just luck, being thorough enough to explore the property, curious enough to investigate a hidden door. But you could have kept all the money. That's what Mom says. You could have just taken it and been really rich, but you chose to use it to fix things instead." Daniel looked at Maya, seeing in her face the reflection of conversations they'd had over 3 decades, of values Emma had taught them both, of choices that had felt obvious at the time but whose full impact was only visible with distance. "Your mom's right. I could have kept it all. But keeping money that came from stealing from workers and destroying ecosystems, that would have felt wrong. Using it to address that harm felt right, even though it meant giving away millions." Maya put her arm around her daughter's shoulders, the gesture connecting generations in a way that made Daniel's chest ache with something between pride and loss. "Grandpa chose to do right even when it was hard, even when it would have been legal and easier to just take the money. That's character. That's the kind of person Grandma Emma wanted him to be, the kind of person I want you to be. But we still have some of the money, right? We're not poor. We kept enough to never worry about money," Daniel said. "Enough that your mom could study environmental science without student debt, enough that you'll be able to go to any college you want, enough that we're secure. But $90 million went to the foundation, to restoration work and community support and compensating people Harrison Barrett stole from. That distribution felt right, keep enough for security, give the rest to addressing harm." As darkness completed its claim on the valley, the restored watershed breathed around them, the sound of clean water moving over stones, the rustle of native plants establishing themselves along the banks, the splash of salmon navigating upstream towards spawning grounds. The land had been damaged profoundly by industrial forestry, had seemed permanently degraded, but patient work funded by Harrison Barrett's hidden fortune had created conditions for healing that would persist for generations. Daniel thought about the trajectory of his life, the desperation that had made $430 seem like a gamble worth taking, the curiosity that had led him to explore a hidden door, the choice to create a foundation rather than just accumulate personal wealth. He'd been shaped by circumstances he hadn't chosen: Emma's death, medical debt, the economic precarity that had made him vulnerable to disaster. But within those circumstances, he'd made choices that reflected values Emma had taught him, that had shaped Maya's understanding of wealth and responsibility, that were now shaping young Emma's understanding of how money and morality intersected. The vault beneath the Sawmill Museum stood empty now, its contents long since liquidated and deployed to restoration and compensation. But it remained as testimony, to Harrison Barrett's fraud, to the harm his wealth was built from, to the choice Daniel had made when he found what had been hidden. Visitors read the displays and learned complete history, understood that the foundation bearing Harrison's name existed because of his crimes and because Daniel had chosen restitution over enrichment. That duality was important, Maya had always insisted. Not erasing Harrison Barrett's role, not pretending the money came from honest sources, but acknowledging that wealth built through exploitation could be deployed to address the damage it caused if people chose responsibility over personal gain. The foundation told that story honestly, showing both the harm and the healing, both the theft and the restitution, both the individual choices and the systemic change those choices had enabled. As they walked back toward the museum where cars were parked and the ceremony was concluding, Daniel felt the weight of 30 years settle into something approaching completion. Not ending, because the foundation's work would continue long after he was gone, but closure on the journey that had started with a desperate gamble on an abandoned sawmill and had led to systematic restoration of damaged ecosystems and compensation for stolen wages and support for communities that had been abandoned when extractive industries collapsed. He'd been an unlikely catalyst, a broke single father buying salvage rights, seeking timber worth thousands and finding instead a fortune worth millions. But he'd made choices that honored Emma's values, that created the foundation for Maya's career, that were now shaping young Emma's understanding of wealth and responsibility. That continuity was what mattered, the understanding that legacy was built through choices compounded over time, that one man's desperate gamble could lead to places that transformed not just his own life but thousands of lives if the person who stumbled into fortune chose responsibility over personal enrichment. The sawmill stood solid against the night sky, its lights warm and welcoming, its purpose transformed from industrial exploitation to education and remembrance, and the headquarters of ongoing restoration work. The building that had processed billions of board feet of old-growth timber now processed grants and managed restoration projects and told the complete story of how wealth was accumulated and how it could be deployed when discovery met conscience. Harrison Barrett's vault had held a fortune built through fraud and environmental destruction. That fortune had been deployed to address the harm it came from, creating symmetry that felt like justice even if it arrived decades late. The work would continue, the foundation would persist, and the land would slowly heal through patient investment and ecological understanding and the recognition that some debts transcended legal obligations and required moral accounting. Daniel had been the instrument of that recognition, had made choices that seemed obvious but had proven unusual, had built something that would outlast him because others had caught the vision and carried it forward. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy written in restored watersheds and compensated workers in supported communities, in the understanding that finding wealth created obligations to address the harm it was built from, in the choice to build something meaningful rather than just accumulate personal fortune. The land would remember all of it, the forests cut and the forests growing, the rivers damaged and the rivers healing, the wealth hidden and the wealth deployed for restoration. Those memories would persist in the ecosystem itself, in the salmon returning to spawn, in the clean water flowing downstream, in the communities that had found resilience through support the foundation provided. That persistence was what mattered, the understanding that right choices created ripples that extended far beyond individual lifespans. 30 years had transformed a desperate gamble into generational impact, had turned $430 into a foundation that had deployed over $100 million for restoration and healing, had created something that honored Emma's memory and shaped Maya's character and was now influencing young Emma's understanding of what wealth meant and what responsibilities it carried. The sawmill had been the catalyst, the vault had held the resources, but the choices made when desperation met fortune, those were what had created everything that followed. Daniel drove home through the restored valley, the truck's headlights illuminating forest that was slowly returning to patterns that predated industrial logging, the rain-soft darkness holding the sound of a river running clean for the first time in generations. The work was patient, would continue regardless of individual lifespans, would carry forward the principle that healing was possible and wealth could be deployed to address harm, and legacy was built through choices compounded over time. That was the real treasure Harrison Barrett had hidden, not the bearer bonds and stock certificates, but the opportunity for someone to find them and choose restitution over enrichment, healing over hoarding, building something meaningful over just accumulating personal fortune. Daniel had been that someone, though he'd arrived desperate and seeking only survival, though he'd made choices that felt obvious but had proven transformative. The foundation would outlive everyone, would continue its work across generations, would stand as proof that buried things eventually surfaced and fortunes built through exploitation could fund restoration and desperate gambles could lead to places that mattered more than anyone could have predicted when the journey began. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.